You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, go to nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 63, introducing Leviticus. I'm your layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Mike Heiser. How are you doing, Mike?
Very good. Good to be back with you, Trey.
Yeah, it's good. Well, this is it, Leviticus.
Oh, yeah. The moment everyone's been waiting for.
Everybody's lining up. No, I mean,
yeah.
The third book of Moses. I mean, let's do this.
Why wouldn't everybody be lining up for Leviticus? That's true. Well, what I want to do today is sort of give people, again, a basic introduction. So we're calling this Introducing Leviticus, and I want to hit two things. That is the flow of the book, flow of the contents, and then some of the important concepts that we're going to run into, with considerable recurrence. And I think even this will be interesting. I think there will be some surprising elements in here, but I want to sort of prep people for what they're going to encounter in Leviticus, because I can't really even assume people have read it. And if they have, maybe read through it at least once, there are some orienting concepts that are going to become really important. Like I said, that'll come up over and over and over again that might sound different than what you may have heard in church. Perish the thought that someone would actually have gone to a church service and heard a sermon on Leviticus. Again, I can't really assume that, but if it's happened, chances are, what was said is not really, pardon the pun, kosher with the way, again, an Israelite would have parsed the contents of Leviticus. So that, just like Naked Bible on the blog, that's our purpose here. What did this book mean in the context of the ancient Near East, the context of the ancient world, the context that produced the thing, as opposed to how we would read it today? Because chances are, if you've heard anything about Leviticus, you've heard something like, "Oh, it's all about Jesus," or this is the book designed to direct us to Jesus. That's not the case. An Israelite reading through the book of Leviticus would not have been thinking Messiah every time they turned a page. They would have thought something about Messiah perhaps in places, but by and large, this is not what they're thinking. So right away, we have a bit of a disconnect. But let's just jump in here with the flow of the contents. The first 7 chapters, the book's only 27 chapters. The first 7 chapters, Leviticus goes through the types of sacrifices. So in the first 3 chapters, we're going to hit the burnt offering, the grain offering, and the peace offering. Now, the burnt offering and the grain offering are 2 types of sacrifices that are actually classified as most sacred. And what that means is not these are, you didn't do this and become more holy than if you did something else. That thinking really pertains to the fact that only priests could partake of the sacrifice, and they were only performed in sacred areas of the sanctuary. So right away, here's a bit of a disconnect, that sacrifices need to be understood in light of who does them and where they're done. Those are 2 aspects that, again, are often neglected. And also, we'll eventually see as we go through the book where the blood is applied and where it isn't applied. So all these sorts of things are going to be important for parsing why are they doing what they're doing and what are they thinking when they're doing it. Now, the third sacrifice in chapters 1 to 3 is the peace offering. The peace offering was essentially a sacred meal. There were certain parts of the sacrifice burned on the altar. Others were boiled in pots, and then a portion among the priests and the donors. So the peace offering is quote-unquote less sacred because the common people, the people who were not priests, could partake of some of the sacrifice. So again, it's just part of the logic of the system. And all these things will hit as we go. So if you're out there listening, don't feel like you got to take notes. This is never going to come up again. That isn't the case. I just want to give you a bit of an overview. Now, these 3 sacrifices, burnt, grain, and peace offering, were performed separately. You could just do one on its own, or in combinations with various celebrations and occasions for worship, either publicly or privately. So they're really about, worship. And again, the question is who's doing it, where are they doing it, who partakes of it, that sort of thing. The next 2 chapters, here's where you get the sin offering and what we call the guilt offering. By the way, as we go through, I'm going to start using other terminology when we actually hit chapters for some of the sacrifices, because terms like sin offering and guilt offering are kind of misleading. They how can I say this? They sort of predispose us to think about the sacrifice in a way that an Israelite would not have thought about it. Let me just give you an example. Both the sin offering and the guilt offering were necessitated by unintentional offenses against God, committed by individuals or their families, by the community or its leaders, whatever. And they are not about sort of moral absolution. A lot of the big sins, at least anyway, that we think of, murder, adultery, and whatnot, they could not be atoned for by any sacrifice. No, the blood of no sacrifice in the Old Testament is ever applied to the sinner. And that again, that's a conceptual disconnect that is often startling if you hear that, you think, well, how can that be like a symbol of what Jesus did? Because the blood of Jesus is applied to us and we're forgiven. Well, there are connections, don't get me wrong, but that is not one of them. You don't have blood applied to the one who brings the offering. On the rare occasion when blood is applied to a person, it's typically the priest, okay? And most often it's some part of the sanctuary, because a lot of the sacrifices are really about purging the sanctuary or purging the holy place or purging the priest or whatever, so that there's no ritual pollution, not moral pollution, but ritual pollution brought into sacred space, the place where God's presence is. It really has nothing to do with sort of an offering for sin like we think of Jesus. And again, it's just a fundamental disconnect and something that we're going to have to deal with on a case-by-case basis as we go through Leviticus. But they have their own logic. The system has its own logic. And I think terms like sin and guilt offering, if that's what we're going to call them, and I'm going to suggest that the Hebrew terms actually mean something different, but that's the way they get translated. But if this is the way we think about them, then we're never really going to get close to what the system actually did or what the system was actually thought to do. We're going to be parsing this material through the event on the cross or through something else in the New Testament. And again, I'm not saying there aren't connection points. There are, and we'll hit those. What I am saying is that the New Testament cannot be a filter for this, just like it shouldn't be a filter for anything else in the Old Testament. We need to take it on its own terms if we're going to understand it. Now, chapter 6 and 7 are regulations about the distribution of various sacrifices to priests and donors. So that sort of builds on the first 5 chapters. The first 5 chapters discuss these 5 kinds of sacrifices, and then 6 and 7 you get more rules. You get a little bit of regulation about how the sacrifices support the priesthood, in terms of sort of a remuneration for their service and whatnot. Chapters 8 through 10, you have actually a ceremonial event described in those chapters. It's the ceremonial founding of the ritual system. So, God tells Moses what to do, and then sort of, okay, now we need to get it started. We need to kickstart the system. And that's what happens in chapters 8 to 10. And that's going to end with the Nadab and Abihu, the way we anglicize it, that incident where the sons of Aaron are killed because they offer strange fire. But that's connected to, again, sort of the ceremonial effort to get the system up and running, that sort of thing. Now, the basic function of the priesthood, we find out in the first 10 chapters, is really to officiate over the system as it's outlined, and also to sort of be on the alert with respect to the matter of purity. And we're going to talk about purity and impurity a little later on after we work through the outline. So we're up to chapter 10, chapters 11 through 16. These are the chapters that people often think of when they think of Leviticus. Clean versus unclean animals, different types of human impurity. The Day of Atonement is chapter 16. So these chapters 11 through 16 really sort of overview purity rules. And again, purity is something we're going to talk about in a moment. Often does not have anything to do with sin. Okay, sometimes it does, but often what we're talking about is ritual purity, fitness to occupy sacred space, as opposed to the commission of a certain sin and then what to do about it. Because oftentimes in the Old Testament law, the solution for what to do about a certain sin is the death penalty. You don't need a sacrifice. We already know what the penalty is for that. You get rid of the person. So again, there's just a fundamental disconnect with what we think of as solutions for sin and what you're going to see in the book of Leviticus. Chapter 17 through 27, then the rest of the book, these last 10, 11 chapters here, are what scholars call the Holiness Code. Now, the Holiness Code really constitutes a statement, an amplification in some senses of the law. It is, in effect, the priestly articulation, or there's sort of the, how can I say this, the priestly involvement, priestly pronouncement of God's will, defines what the God of Israel requires for the people of Israel, and how the priests are supposed to oversee that in terms of how God is to be worshipped. So you get chapter 17, you have a discussion on what proper worship is, where you're supposed to present your sacrifices, what's a legitimate sacrifice, that sort of thing, what to do with the blood. So it's a procedural kind of chapter. You get in chapters 18 through 20, you get community laws, which these are the chapters where there's a discussion of sexual prohibitions, which are not, it's only one emphasis in these chapters. It's not the whole emphasis of the chapters, but other laws that concern community behavior, religious and social behavior. Again, I already mentioned, sexual behavior. And again, these laws have to do with both the status of the person being able to occupy sacred space, and in these chapters you also get into the issue of moral uncleanness, principles of morality. So principles of ritual fitness are distinct from principles of morality. We tend, again, to link both of those things, but Israelite law did not, and the practice of Israelite law did not as well. And as we go through the book of Leviticus, we're going to be, again, parsing a lot of this out. Chapters 21 to 22 concerns the sanctity of the priesthood. What would disqualify a priest? What are the criteria for suitability to be a priest, that sort of thing. Chapter 23 is the sacred calendar. So that's where we see spelled out what the religious calendar of Israel is, what you do at certain times, what the celebrations are, how they're to be conducted, those sorts of things. Chapter 24, you get more sanctuary procedure, and you get comments about blasphemy. Again, it helps us understand the concept of blasphemy, but specifically in this chapter, you get discussion of the eternal light and the bread that is to be displayed inside the sanctuary. And then we get an incident related where, again, the sacred space was blasphemed and what the punishment was. So we're still dealing, again, largely with procedures for taking care of the sanctuary, taking care of sacred space, and when sacred space is violated, what happens? That's chapter 24. Chapter 25 is sort of an economic chapter. It deals with how the nation should treat its members in terms of economic viability. There's a whole system in Leviticus set up so that widespread poverty should not be present in the land. Again, this is something that the priests are supposed to oversee. You get the law of Jubilee in here, that sort of thing. Laws about who owns the land, tenants, laws of slaves, that sort of thing. So this is where you get sort of a socio-economic subsystem within, again, what we would broadly call a Levitical system. So that Leviticus spends a whole chapter on really the big conceptual ideas of who owns the land, really. The fact that we're all stewards and tenants on the land. It's not just somebody with wealth who has servants or whatnot. Ultimately, God is the owner of all the land. We have a responsibility to Him. He tells us, to free, the slave and to free the land at certain intervals. We have a collective responsibility for making sure that the land yields enough so that, again, we don't have this never-ending poverty situation for the poor, that sort of thing. And then finally, your last two chapters, 26 and 27, really consist of blessings and cursings, and again, how the priesthood is supposed to administer all this. So, it ends with, hey, if you follow all this, things are going to be great. If you don't, things are going to be awful, and the land is going to, spit you out. You're going to go into exile, and, things are just going to be terrible. And, we can look back and read that and know what happened with the exile and whatnot. And so some of that is sort of spelled out, foretold, envisioned, that kind of thing in these two chapters. What we're going to see as we shift now into concepts, important concepts for Leviticus, is that certain violations of Levitical procedure, and even more so, specific moral obligations, moral impurity, can actually pollute the entire community and pollute the entire land. And in some cases, there's actually no solution for it other than hit the reset button, which is apocalyptic. And it involves exile. Again, some of these things we know that are going to happen from later in the Old Testament, but they're actually sort of brought up and introduced in this book. So by way of concepts, let's start with sacred space. This is the idea that there is holy ground and there is unholy ground. And when I say unholy ground, I'm referring to ground that is not set aside for the occupation of Yahweh's presence. It's mundane, it's profane in the sense that it's normal. Sacred space is special. It is designed and really has to be prepared, and once prepared is only for the presence of Yahweh and those who he permits to have or share that access, and even those people have to be ritually prepared to enter that space. So there's a very clear concept in Leviticus of sacred space, holy versus unholy, holy versus profane, or normal or mundane ground. Now, I'm going to read you a fairly lengthy segment from Jacob Milgrom, who's a Jewish scholar and scholar of Judaic studies and also Jewish ritual. I'm going to read you a lengthy portion of his commentary about Leviticus, and I'm going to disagree with it at a number of points, and I'll tell you where and why. But his description, I think, is really well put and applies very well to protecting holy ground from violations. Again, just some of the logic to it. So here's Milgrom from his Continental Commentary on Leviticus. This is pages 8 and 9, or at least it'll cover pages 8 and 9. I'll break this up into a few segments, but quote for Milgrom, the basic premises of pagan religion are, number one, that its deities are themselves dependent on and influenced by a meta-divine realm. And number two, that this realm spawns a multitude of malevolent and benevolent entities. And third, that if humans can tap into this realm, they can acquire the magical power to coerce the gods to do their will. The eminent Assyriologist W.G. Lambert has stated, quote, the impression is gained that everyday religion in Mesopotamia was dominated by fear of evil powers and black magic rather than a positive worship of the gods. The world was conceived to be full of evil demons who might cause trouble in any sphere of life. If they had attacked, the right ritual could effect a cure. Humans, as well as devils or demons, might work evil against a person by the black arts, and here too the appropriate ritual was required. Unquote from Lambert. Continuing with Milgrom, Milgrom writes, the priestly theology of Leviticus negates these premises. It posits the existence of one supreme God who contends neither with a higher realm nor with competing peers. I'm going to disagree with Milgrom there in a moment. The world of demons is abolished. There is no struggle with autonomous foes because there are none. With the demise of the demons, only one creature remains with demonic power, and that is the human being. Endowed with free will, human power is greater than any attributed to humans by pagan society. Not only can one defy God, not only can a human defy God, but in priestly imagery, one can drive God out of his sanctuary through violation. In this respect, humans have replaced demons, unquote. Now, I'm going to disagree with that because it's flawed reasoning. Milgrom ignores the book of Deuteronomy. I can't put it any other way. Scholars who, of course, would have done a lot of work in Deuteronomy would look at that statement by Milgrom and go, well, that's crazy talk because of Deuteronomy 32 and lots of other stuff in Deuteronomy. While it's true that Levitical theology doesn't have people tapping into the divine realm by means of lesser divinities, in other words, the humans don't use lesser divine beings to tap into this realm to create spells to go get somebody like a Mesopotamian would think. Well, that's true. Regardless, even though that's the case, and we have to reject the idea that God can be coerced, they are not a statement. These ideas do not overturn the notion about territory that is not Yahweh's allotment by his own decision. That's the Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 worldview. In other words, Levitical theology concerns what is supposed to go on or not within Yahweh's domain. It doesn't have anything to say, and this is where I think Milgrom misses the boat, it doesn't have anything to say on other domains. The other nations that are put under the authority of the sons of God. Leviticus has nothing to say about that. So Milgrom is sort of myopic here. He's focused only on the Levitical ritual system as it pertains to Israel. Well, yeah, in Israel, in Yahweh's sacred space, you don't have these intermediate demons and all this other stuff. That talk is reserved for the nations outside Israel, and that's what Milgrom is missing in those two paragraphs that I read. The rationale, which is quite oppositional to Mesopotamian thinking, which is truly polytheistic, is still sort of telling. Israelite thinking about sacred space is not a mere adoption of somebody else's concept. Rather, Leviticus is concerned with what goes on here in Yahweh's territory, Yahweh's inheritance. We don't really care in Leviticus about what goes on elsewhere in the realm of other gods, the allotment of the other gods. That alone is sort of a theological statement in and of itself, because Levitical thinking about sacred space doesn't imitate Mesopotamia. The priesthood doesn't relate to the God of Israel through intermediate demonic figures. They don't have to practice black magic and stuff like this. They don't need to coerce lesser divine beings, these demonic figures, to go get something done that the God of Israel won't do for them. You don't have this intermediate world inside Israel. So Milgram is correct in that sense, but I think he's far too categorical in his language, because the Israelite worldview, certainly because of the book of Deuteronomy, includes the notion that there are other divine powers outside Israel that offer some serious problems and can seriously violate Yahweh's own sacred space, and that frankly are in opposition to him. I'm going to pick up with Milgram again, another excerpt from his commentary. Milgram writes, "The pagans secured the perpetual aid of a benevolent deity by building him or her a temple residence in which the deity was housed and fed and worshipped in exchange for protective care. Above all, the temple had to be inoculated by apotropaic rites, that is, utilizing magic drawn from the divine realm, against incursions by malevolent forces from the supernal and infernal worlds. The priestly theologians, in other words, the people who produce Leviticus, in his view, make use of the same imagery, except that the demons are replaced by humans." Again, I would say to Milgram, this is me breaking in here now, I would say to Milgram, that's because Leviticus is only concerned with what goes on in Yahweh's domain, not other domains. But anyway, Milgram writes, "Humans can drive God out of the sanctuary by polluting it with their moral and ritual sins. All that the priest can do is periodically purge the sanctuary of its impurities and try to influence people to atone for their wrongdoing. Or again, in the case of some Mosaic law, this is me talking now, exert the death penalty, that sort of thing." So what the priesthood, I'm going to end the quote from Milgram there, what the priesthood in Leviticus is really about, again, I think he says this well, is that once the sanctuary is polluted, once sacred space is polluted, and it would be polluted by a violation of all sorts of things that are spelled out in Leviticus and in a few other places in the Torah. Once that happens, what do we do? So the emphasis in Leviticus, and largely all of the sacrifices, at least the ones that are quote-unquote sin and guilt offerings, unquote, the emphasis of those sacrifices is not to apply the blood to the individual person who committed the wrong and extend forgiveness to them on some moral basis. The blood is never applied to them. Rather, the blood is applied to the sanctuary to purge it of pollution. So the emphasis is not on the bringer of the offering. The emphasis is on the sacred space, purifying it, making it fit for Yahweh's presence again after it has been violated. Again, it's just a fundamental idea that's going to come up again and again and again as we go through Leviticus. That's going to sound quite different than what you may have heard about with respect to sacrifices elsewhere. Okay, back to Milgram. He says here, this thoroughgoing evisceration of the demonic, again, I would put it this way, a thoroughgoing neglect or apathy toward the demonic, because we're talking about Yahweh's domain, not other domains. But back to Milgram, this thoroughgoing evisceration of the demonic also transformed the concept of impurity. In Israel, impurity was harmless. It retained potency only with regard to the sanctuary or holy objects, the sanctums. Laypersons, but not priests, might contract impurity with impunity. They must not, however, delay their purificatory rites, lest their impurity affect the sanctuary. That was the real concern. Again, infecting holy ground, you're going to see, is the fundamental concern with the system in Leviticus. The retention of, this is back to Milgram, the retention of impurity's dynamic power in regard to sanctums served a theological function. The sanctuary symbolized the presence of God. Impurity represented the wrongdoing of persons. If persons unremittingly polluted the sanctuary, they forced God out of his sanctuary, at least in theory, and out of their lives, unquote. Again, I like the way he puts certain things there. It's good data, but again, it's flawed thinking when it comes to the bigger picture. The Old Testament is quite clear that worship of other deities, idolatry, polluted the land, and in so doing, polluted Yahweh's territory. So again, for that to be valid, we have to acknowledge and recognize with books like Deuteronomy and, of course, lots of other places that there are other gods out there, and they are hostile. They are in opposition to Yahweh, and they must not be worshipped. If they are, by definition, this is both a moral and a potentially ritual violation of not only the sanctuary, but the entire land. And that's an important idea. In other words, Israelites wouldn't have concluded that there were such things as hostile gods, and so those gods couldn't really profane anything because, again, we have these other books. An Israelite would not be thinking that there aren't any other gods. He would be thinking in this territory, in Yahweh's domain, we don't have this intermediate world. It's just Yahweh here. That I think is a better articulation, incorporating books like Deuteronomy and other material alongside Leviticus than Milgram is doing. But I still like the way Milgram, puts some things. Now, one thing we need to say as well, again, just for emphasis here, these laws about sacred space inform us that violations of the sanctuary were mostly, again, not thought of in terms of moral sins, like committing an unvirtuous act. Now, for sure, if you did certain sins, it could lead to violation of sacred space, but holiness laws generally are concerned with becoming infected ritually and therefore putting the sanctuary in peril of being violated. We have to think in terms of the place and the space as opposed to the person, and that will help us in Leviticus. That's why a lot of these laws about purity are described in terms of contact with dead things, bodily functions, unclean animals, diseases. For some reason, and when we get to each of those, I'll discuss what the logic is behind these things. But when you were polluted yourself by these things, the danger is great that you could drift into sacred space or touch an object meant for use on sacred space and therefore violate the whole system. So it was the otherness of God, the thing that defined sacred space, that was the concern again. Sacrifice was about correcting violations of sacred space, sacred territory. It wasn't so much to cover a moral flaw or a moral sin. It was about making people fit to occupy sacred space. And again, this is only for unintentional violations. These sacrifices are for unintentional sins, as we'll see. When it came to intentional sins, there was just a different matter there. Now you might be thinking, well, what about Leviticus 16? Didn't that atone for everybody's sins sort of all at the same time? There's actually quite a controversy over that. I'm actually of the opinion that Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement, was not about atoning for individual moral failures, sins in that respect. But even that ritual was still about cleansing the sanctuary, because the only time that the blood is ever mentioned as being applied anywhere in Leviticus 16 is the sanctuary and the sacred objects. It's still not the people. But again, when we get to Leviticus 16, I'll present you with both views and you can make up your own mind. But I just want you to know that even Leviticus 16, which is supposed to be this catch-all forgiveness passage for Old Testament people, that's not the only way you can look at that if you look through the whole chapter. And again, that might be different than what you have heard. I hope you're already seeing that, boy, what was done at the cross is a whole lot better than this. And yeah, that's the point of the book of Hebrews, that the blood of bulls and goats could not do certain things, whereas the blood of Christ could. So there's an inherent superiority to what we're talking about with what happened on the cross as opposed to Leviticus. And I actually think that's blurred a little bit with the way evangelicals in particular talk about Leviticus, if they ever talk about it at all. Let's move on to another concept, holiness, or the clean versus unclean language. Now, fundamentally, I have to start out by saying this: holiness in Leviticus, holiness in the Old Testament system, is not about morality, though morality is included in the idea. In the Old Testament, you have land, you have objects, you have garments, etc., that are called holy. Now, a piece of land and an object and a garment can't engage in moral or immoral behavior. So holiness, the terminology itself, should not be linked primarily with moral or immoral behavior. There's something else going on here. The concept actually has to do with something being set apart for sacred space and the divine presence. That's really what holiness is about. I have another source here. J.E. Hartley did the entry on holy and holiness, clean and unclean in the Dictionary of the Old Testament Pentateuch volume. And I'm going to read you a little bit of that selection because, again, I think he puts things well and helps us to parse what the terms mean and don't mean. So to quote Hartley, beginning, 2 ideas commonly associated with holiness need to be qualified at the outset. First, holiness is often defined as separation because objects and persons consecrated for use at the sanctuary are removed or set apart from ordinary use. However, separation does not get at the essential meaning of holiness, neither in reference to God, the Holy One, nor in reference to the variety of items described as holy, because it fails to provide any content to the concept of being holy. Second, the ethical and the holy are often equated, so that the terms are used synonymously. In biblical faith, this is common because Yahweh, the holy God, is righteous. Consequently, holy defines the character of biblical ethics. Nevertheless, Hartley says, we need to be aware that holiness encompasses far more than ethical behavior. In fact, in most other religions, holiness and the ethical are not connected at all. In non-biblical contexts, holy often refers to a sacred power that inhabits an element of nature, such as a tree or a stream or a specific space like a burial ground. These sacred objects or places, being closely related to the spirit world, have numinous qualities. In the polytheistic religions of Israel's neighbors, only some of the gods possessed holy power, albeit imperfectly. Holiness is a spiritual force often stood over against the various gods of a pantheon. Now, rules, Hartley continues, on ritual purity were not designated or designed either to separate the Israelites from dealing with foreigners or to set up classes within Israelite society, as was often the case in other cultures. This claim is supported by the fact that most causes of uncleanness come from a person's body. The body of every person, both priest and laity, not from contact with certain classes or with foreigners. The purpose of these rules was to establish boundaries in the routine of daily life in order that the Israelites might live as a holy people serving Yahweh, who is holy. The primary boundary was to prevent any impure person or thing from entering sacred space. Therefore, everyone had to be ritually clean before entering the sanctuary, lest the holiness of God consume them. Now, to summarize all that, it's the end of the Hartley quote. To summarize all that, I hope you're seeing some major points. Holiness, it's not adequate to define holiness as separation, because just the fact that a thing is removed from ordinary use doesn't really assign any quality to it. It doesn't really provide any rationale to the thing that's separated. It might be a cup, might be a plate, might be a garment, okay, might be some other ritual object. The fact that it's not used by people tells us that it's special, it's removed, it's quote unquote holy, but it doesn't really provide any basis for understanding what holiness means. That's one fundamental thought. Second is we can't necessarily equate ethical behavior, moral behavior, with holiness. They're related, but they're not completely overlapping synonyms. So we can't use them synonymously because, again, inanimate objects could be holy. Okay, inanimate objects can't engage in moral or immoral behavior. And then also, holiness doesn't really have anything to do per se with Israelites and within the Israelite community, certain classes of people and even foreigners. Now, what Hartley is getting at here is that we can't look at the Levitical system when certain people are excluded from holy ground or sacred space because they touched a carcass or because a woman is in her menstrual cycle. She is unclean, but it's ritually unclean. It has nothing to do with morality. It has nothing to do, with some sort of good or bad behavior. She is unclean because of the flow of blood, and she is unclean in a ritual sense where she, for some reason, again, we'll explore the logic of it later, she's not allowed on sacred space. She's no farther away, though, in a moral sense from God than someone who can step onto holy ground. Okay, ritual impurity has nothing to do with someone's walk with God or their spiritual life. Now, it could, let's say that someone says, well, I don't care if I'm ritually impure and I'm not going through any of the procedures, and I'm just going to go violate all these stupid laws as many times as I can during a day. Well, that becomes a hard-heartedness issue. But just the incident of becoming unclean, according to Levitical law, has no necessary connection with a person being quote-unquote right with God, in terms of their spiritual life or their love for God. Again, we have to be able to make these distinctions when we talk about Leviticus and we talk about the whole Old Testament system that we often put together and conflate in evangelical talk about the sacrifices. We tend to view this stuff through the lens of the New Testament, through devotional stuff, through preaching talk, about walking with God and being close to God. Oh, she couldn't be close to God because she had her menstrual cycle. So in the Old Testament, there was something wrong with. No, there's nothing wrong with her. Okay, the issue with her is that because of this bodily function, which is entirely normal, she is not fit for sacred space, and that has to be taken care of. It has nothing. It's no commentary on that woman's love for God or God's love for her. These rules are designed to teach certain things about the nature of God and his otherness. And again, as we go through Leviticus, we'll start to see some of this in more detail and with more specificity. Now, lastly, one other concept is, and this is going to be related to what we just talked about, the concept of impurity, ritual impurity versus moral sin. We need to say something about that. Essentially, what you have in the Levitical system, and I'm relying here on the work of Jonathan Clowens, or it's probably better to say I think his work makes the most sense of the material I've read on ritual systems in Leviticus. There are essentially two types of impurity in the Old Testament system. One is ritual impurity, the other is moral impurity. Let's talk about some of the differences, and I think, again, you're not going to remember all these things, but they're going to come up again as we go through the book. Characteristics of ritual impurity are things like the following. Ritual impurity will result from contact with perfectly natural sources or events that are basically unavoidable in life. Things like childbirth, Leviticus 12, that creates ritual impurity when a woman bears a child. It's no commentary on being close to God or not. There's a ritual significance to it because of the loss of blood. Again, we'll get to it. But we've got contact with natural sources or events that are just unavoidable. Childbirth, skin disease, Leviticus 13:14. You've got genital discharges, both male and female, Leviticus 15. Touching a dead body. So what it amounts to is things like birth, death, sex, and disease can render you impure. And they're all part of normal life. Again, but we're talking about ritual impurity. And even some priests obviously could not avoid these because the priests have to have contact with the dead to dispose of the dead. They become ritually impure. It's part of their job. To become impure was part of their job. And it's not a moral thing. This is ritual impurity. Becoming ritually impure is never described as sinful. Okay? You'll never see that. And it would be nonsense given the nature of ritual impurity. Just things in life that you can't avoid. Now, if you refuse to take care of ritual impurity, there are passages in Leviticus and Numbers that talk about a person being cut off from the community, essentially banned. Some scholars even think it's a death penalty, but it just says cut off from the community. So yeah, it can become extreme, but in and of itself, ritual impurity, the characteristics are, these are natural events, natural sources, natural things you encounter in life, and they're not described as sinful. Other characteristics. Ritual impurity is contagious. In other words, if someone, let's say a woman who is in her menstrual cycle, she becomes ritually impure because of that, she can touch another person and render them ritually impure, like herself. See, moral impurity, you're not going to have that. If a person commits adultery and goes up and touches somebody else, that doesn't make them an adulterer. There's quite a bit of difference here. Ritual impurity is contagious. Ritual impurity is also not permanent. There were procedural things you could do to become ritually pure. Ritual impurity also excluded people from certain ritual acts and entering sacred areas. If an Israelite commits adultery and nobody knows about it, they can bring a sacrifice and enter sacred space and nothing happens according to Levitical law. Again, the issue with that problem is moral impurity, not ritual impurity. They're two different things. Now, let's talk about the characteristics of moral impurity then. So we went through ritual impurity again, just to summarize them. You're rendered ritually impure by natural sources or events. They're never described as sinful. I mean, how could they be? Because you can't avoid them. Ritual impurity is contagious, though. It's not permanent, and it will exclude people from certain ceremonies or certain areas. But it can be taken care of, again, through different procedures. Now, moral impurity, again, we're not talking about the same thing. These are acts that, according to Leviticus, according to Old Testament law, were considered, quote, defiling. That is, these are acts, these are sins that bring about an impurity that morally corrupts and defiles the sinner. And even the land itself. If you want a sort of a proof text for that, Leviticus 18, 24, and 25, will illustrate that. Oddly enough, though, again, it didn't really defile sacred space, because if a person did one of these sins and it wasn't known to the community, they could still, bring an offering for something else and sort of go through the motions and hide their sin. And there was no way to detect it. And it wouldn't necessarily defile sacred space. Now, if it became known and the person entered sacred space, that's a different story. Then we have to, again, repair the sacred area through, again, ritual. So moral impurity, again, is moral corruption, impurity that morally defiles and corrupts the sinner. Specifically, these are sins that are mentioned in Leviticus and in Numbers that are of this category, that constitute moral impurity. You have sexual sins. Leviticus 18, 24 through 30 has a list of them. Idolatry is one of these. It's Leviticus 19 and 20, first couple verses of chapter 20. And bloodshed. Again, unwarranted bloodshed. This would be like, deliberate intentional murder, that kind of thing. The taking of an innocent life was viewed as one of these defiling sins. That's from Numbers 35, verses 33 and 34. So these are quite a bit different. To summarize the differences, let's do it this way before we close. We'll wrap up with this. What are the differences between ritual and moral impurity that we will see in the book of Leviticus? Number one, ritual impurity normally is not the result of specific sin. Moral impurity is the direct result of a specific and, frankly, a serious sin. Number two, ritual impurity is contagious. It can defile others by contact. Moral impurity is never described that way. Again, touching an adulterer or murderer doesn't make you an adulterer or a murderer. But if you touched a ritually impure person, you became impure. You had to go through the same procedures before you could occupy sacred space again. Third, ritual impurity is temporary, assuming the procedures to restore purity were followed. Moral impurity is basically permanent in Old Testament law. What are the solutions? Well, adultery, solution is the death penalty. Murder, solution is the death penalty. Again, there are no sacrifices for these things. There is no restoration for these things. Now, there are some other laws that don't result in the death penalty. What happens if I steal? Okay, Old Testament law said you needed to restore. You needed to give back what you stole and then give beyond that. There's this remunerative idea, again, to certain sins. But there are a whole host of things in Old Testament law that you couldn't cure by performing a sacrifice, because the sacrifice was not about moral impurity. The sacrificial system is basically all about taking care of ritual impurity. Fourth, ritual impurities have procedural cures, but moral impurities do not. Again, overlaps with what I just said. The guilty are punished for moral impurities. Again, death penalty, that sort of thing. Even victims of morally impure, morally detestable acts, like, let's say, rape, even victims sort of are unfortunately permanently debased. In other words, they're never going to be what they were before. They might have a lesser social status. There might be a stigma to it, even as a victim, especially something like a rape. I think of the case of Dinah, which was Joseph and his brothers, their sister. Because she's defiled, mean, she's not morally culpable for any of that, but her status in the community, not in terms of, oh, you did a heinous act, but this is just awful. You've lost your virginity, and now it's going to be much more difficult, to have you get married, because a lot of men will not want to marry, someone who has been defiled. So there, it has a social impact on people, even certain victims like that. Again, there's no cure for that because they didn't sin. It's just one of these things about the Old Testament law, and how the people, conceptually at the time, how they would view a victim in a case like that. You couldn't just fix it. And, frankly, in our own, culture, when people are victimized by certain crimes, sometimes it's just not fixable. So the Old Testament, system has its own situations that are similar to ours and their own way of coping with it or not than we would. But ritual impurity, none of that is ever a concern. Victims of morally, heinous acts, so that, sometimes you can't fix it. And there's no sacrifice that can undo what was done. And it's unfortunate, but that is the way it is. I would say the same goes for the land. I mean, we talk about individual victims, but according to Leviticus 18, for instance, the ultimate result of unchecked moral pollution is that the land is polluted and cannot be fixed. The ultimate way that you would have to deal with this is to exile the people. And at some point, the land would have to be supernaturally made new. And frankly, in biblical theology, that's only going to happen at one time. That's at the eschaton, the day of the Lord. I mean, there are certain sins that, again, if left unchecked, were so serious that Leviticus says, well, what happens here is that God will just have to drive the people out. And the land is just polluted. And it has to be made new by God himself. And again, that's eschatological language. You don't just reverse that. So again, it was a serious thing. Lastly, again, we're talking about differences between ritual and moral impurity. Even the vocabulary is different. Moral impurity has a unique vocabulary associated with it. Moral violations are described with certain terms that are not used for ritual impurity. And the two most telling are to'eva in Hebrew, which is the word that's translated abomination. You will never see a ritual impurity situation ever described as an abomination. That language is reserved for moral impurity. And the other term is kanaf, which is the verb for to pollute. That verb is not used of ritual impure situations, but moral impurity, you will see that term used. Again, even the vocabulary is distinct. So as we go through Leviticus, again, I've just overviewed a few of the key concepts. There are other things that we're going to hit, but a lot of the book is about, is really decipherable only if you keep in mind the differences between ritual impurity, moral impurity, and if you start to get a grasp of ideas like sacred space, ground, reserved, for the divine presence, and any others that only he could permit on it. And then the whole idea of clean and unclean, or holy and unclean, really, in large part, again, there's an overlap here because that terminology will be used of ritual violations and moral violations, but those two are not the same thing. Holiness, in large part, really relates to making something or some person fit to occupy sacred space. It has nothing to do with someone's relationship with God in a spiritual sense, or in an emotional sense, or anything like that. So if you can wrap your mind around, again, some of these concepts, it'll help you keep the content of Leviticus in your head a little straighter. And as we go through, you'll see how the system sort of worked and how it applied. And I think a recurring lesson will be how much better off we are because of the cross, as the writer of Hebrews says.
Mike, can you touch on the Mosaic authorship of Leviticus?
Yeah, there is an issue here because of the holiness code. There are some who would take the holiness code, and if you recall from the introduction, that was basically the last 10 chapters. Some, would apply this to, how can I say it? There are parts of Leviticus that some scholars would not attribute to Moses because they think that certain of the decisions, the the way the laws work out, and the way they're put in place, is a reaction specifically to certain things that occurred like during the period of the judges or during the monarchy. In other words, a post-Mosaic time. I think some of that is possible, but I don't, in the sense of authorship, I don't think it really matters when you're dealing with post-Mosaic or Mosaic material, because the only way it would really matter is if something is unique in a post-Mosaic sense as opposed to a Mosaic sense. In other words, to me, that kind of talk only really makes a difference if there's something new that you could not find in Mosaic law, that like some later edition that was innovative or just doesn't have any precedent in the time of Moses. And I think a lot of this is really quite ancient, and the logic of it is quite ancient, certainly in a chronological sense, overlapping with what would have been the lifetime of Moses. So, I guess a short summary is, there is some dispute, over did Moses, write all of Leviticus, or if not, what parts? And again, I'm bringing into the questions here. Does it even matter? I've talked about JEDP and Mosaic authorship before, and again, to me, I'm what used to be called a supplementarian, as I've said before. That I think when we look at the Torah, a lot of it is certainly either written by Moses or would have been written down, perhaps maybe uttered by Moses and written down by somebody else, either contemporary with him or shortly after his life, but it's still Mosaic, that sort of thing. But I'm willing to consider that certain portions of it, could have been applications of older Mosaic material, responding to new situations, new circumstances, but still consistent again with what would have been practiced during the time of Moses. So I don't know if that helps specifically, but again, that's the way I look at the whole situation.
Was the writing style back then to refer to yourself in the third person? Because,
Yeah, that happens a lot. That's actually a broad literary phenomenon known as Iliism. You'll see this throughout the Pentateuch, where God will refer to himself as the third person. You'll see it in Shakespeare. I mean, you'll see it in lots of different places, and it's a self-referential thing. So we can't take that language, for instance, and use it to say, well, boy, we must have two or three or a trinity here because God uses the third person when he's the speaker. It's actually a literary phenomenon or technique that is often employed to catch the attention and therefore possibly, to emphasize something that's coming. But it would catch the ear or the eye, but it's still one speaker. Again, in the instance, the example that you're bringing up here.
I'm also curious, Mike, how do Jews parse Leviticus versus Christians in today's time?
Well, they don't have, obviously the Jewish experience is really a post-temple experience, a post-tabernacle, post-sanctuary, post-sacrifice experience, because of the exile. And even after the exile, during the Second Temple period, the lack of complete control over their own land. Yes, we do have Pharisees, we do have Sadducees, we do have some semblance in a small way to what would have been under the monarchy. But once you get past 70 AD, when there is no temple at all, and you sort of have a situation like you had during the exile, after the first temple was destroyed before the second temple was built, those circumstances actually really are more similar to what we have now. I mean, Jews do not worship in temples. There is no temple. So we go to synagogue, and that is the era when, instead of the Levitical system having such a focus, because you need to maintain sacred space so that you can, bring your sacrifice. You can offer a burnt offering, which was a worship sacrifice. You can do these sorts of things. You have to enter sacred space to do that. When you don't have that, and you don't have a Levitical system, the thing that becomes primary is Torah, because that is the written word of God, and it can be taught in synagogues, and of course was. And so that is really the emphasis in synagogues now. It's what does the Torah say? We still try to observe the festivals, the major events that are described in the Torah, even though we don't offer sacrifice. So we still, they adapted how they do Passover. They would adapt, other holidays, Sukkot. So that there's still an effort to observe these things, but it's really done in the absence of a system, that involves, sacrifices and whatnot.
Okay, well, good deal. That's
And they added some too. Hanukkah. That's not a biblical festival. I mean, if you embrace the Alexandrian canon and you have the books of Maccabees in there, then you could say, well, Hanukkah is just as it belongs in the ritual inspired calendar, just like anything else does, because of the book of Maccabees and what happened during those events. Okay, but even if you don't, Jews are still going to celebrate that.
all righty. Well, good deal. Well, looking forward to that next week. Which chapters, Mike, are we going to be jumping into?
We're just going to hit. We'll hit chapter 1. I mean, I'm going to try because the sacrifices tend to be a little complicated. I think we're probably going to be well advised to take a chapter at a time. I don't know. I might get into it. Might read through and think maybe we can add one, but chapters 1 through 3, 1 through 5, each chapter is devoted to a sacrifice. So my intention at this point is to hit them one at a time, but definitely 4 and 5, sin offering and guilt offering, could be considered together, but I could think of good reasons to keep them apart too. And I think one apiece is probably what we'll end up doing.
Okay, sounds good. I want to thank everybody for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.
You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 64, Leviticus 1. I'm your layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike, how you doing this week?
Very good, Trey. Good to be back.
Yeah, good. Well, I'm excited to get started with Leviticus. I got my knife sharpened, my fire burning.
I've gotten emails that ask me if I was kidding.
What, about doing the show?
Right. No, about doing Leviticus. So, I guess for some it's going to be a tough pill to swallow, but oh well. My goal, in doing Leviticus, I'm not going to go through every verse and talk about where they sliced and diced this or that. My goal in doing Leviticus is, hey, who does Leviticus? For one thing, so it deserves some attention. And secondly is that there are things in here that I want to touch on that will just sort of help us kind of have the Israelite in our head. How did they think about what they were doing? How did they think about what was happening? How they were engaging God? Again, some of the bigger picture concepts we talked about in the introduction, ideas of sacred space, the presence of God. And when we get into the sacrificial system, what did the sacrifices mean or not mean? Why are they talked about the way they're talked about? That sort of thing. So we're not going to do nitty gritty verse by verse kind of thing. Just like with Acts, I'm going to go through and pick out things that are worth mentioning that, again, will help give us some insight and make the book more readable, frankly. So in terms of getting started here, I want to go through some preliminaries again before we jump into the first verse. And this will sort of be, again, preparatory. Now, there are, as you can imagine, a number of theories about sacrifice that scholars have come up with. And a lot of these things, I'm just going to go through them real briefly. They're going to sound familiar because they're kind of self-evident if you've ever read through Leviticus or any other sacrificial material in the Old Testament. Chances are these things will have occurred to you. And all of these different approaches, I say theories of offering and sacrifice, but really they're just approaches. All of these approaches capture some aspect of what's going on in the sacrificial system, but they're not comprehensive. In other words, they all have something good to say, something good to contribute in the way we think about sacrifice. So the first one, for example, is something that scholars call gift theory. That is, Old Testament offerings seem to be gifts to the Lord. Now that might sound self-evident, but since there are other views, other ways to look at sacrifice, this is just one of several. This revolves around the notion that, hey, it sounds like when I read the sacrificial material that people are bringing sacrificial gifts to the Lord, and they're made up of food items. And it looks like they're sort of presented as food for God. So, like, what's up with that? Well, scholars like Dick Averbeck, who I will quote and allude to several times today and in other episodes, I'm sure, since his focus is ritual, have pointed out that in the ancient Near East, food offerings, again, are at least sometimes conceived of as actually providing sustenance for the gods. Now, the question is, well, is that how the biblical writer is thinking about things? In Mesopotamian texts and rituals, there's this sort of care and feeding of the gods that goes on. And that a lot of that language, does get drawn over into the Old Testament. But again, is that the way we should, be looking at some of these things? It's sort of a yes and no. It's true. Again, Israelites didn't have statues of God that they would lay offerings at or pour, some libation at the feet or something like that. But you still have this language about the Lord's table and the Lord's food, that sort of thing. So there's a little bit of this idea going on, but not quite, and certainly not in several specifics, not what's going on in quote unquote pagan religion. The God of Israel, according to the Old Testament, didn't need to eat. If you go to Psalm 50, for example, you would read, where God says, "If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness are mine. Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats?" Again, the rhetorical question is, well, that's kind of silly. And God says, "Offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Perform your vows to the Most High." Again, the psalmist chimes in there. So that's an example where the psalmist specifically says, look, there's no actual consumption going on here like, some of our neighbors might think. But nevertheless, offerings are referred to as the Lord's food in certain passages, Leviticus 3:11, 3:16. Throughout the book of Leviticus, you're going to get this language here and there. You're going to get the idea that burning the offering, quote, produces an aroma pleasing to the Lord. So you're going to get, some sort of anthropomorphic language. But elsewhere in the Old Testament, you're going to get the denial that there's actually anything sort of literal, going on here as far as consumption. So yeah, no. Gift theory, sort of, kind of, sort of. A little bit of this, but not so much of that is sort of the feel that you get. Another example would be the bread of the presence. This people might find interesting, and we'll hit this later on in Leviticus a little bit, but for the most part, this is something we'd get if we were going through Exodus talking about the tabernacle. The whole bread of the presence idea, where the bread is continually placed on the gold table inside the holy place every Sabbath, and there's always a light on. There's this continually burning light in the holy place according to Exodus 27. This is really Exodus 25 through 27, and the incense is always, being burned. Well, all of that was to create the impression that God was home, okay, that the divine presence was always present inside the holy place, as though God were physically living there. Again, people knew that wasn't the case. I mean, yes, God does get embodied in the angel who's leading them and so on and so forth, but it's not like you could peek into the window of the tabernacle, so to speak, from a distance, a safe distance, and see God walking around in there like he's home. He's not kicking up and doing something or having a snack. I mean, but nevertheless, you have these trappings that are associated with the tabernacle to, again, convey the idea that the presence of God is here in our camp. It's really here. He's really here. And you don't need embodiment for that, but you do need some sort of visual way to communicate the idea, and this is what's going on. And so when they present offerings, yeah, they're gifts, and they are spoken of as food offerings and whatnot. But the Israelites know very well that we don't have an embodied deity in there munching on something after a sacrifice. So we can't overly literalize this. Another approach, another theory is communion theory. This is the idea where the point of the sacrificial system is communion with the Lord. Now, in some sacrifices, that very explicitly is the point of the sacrifice, but other sacrifices, it's not really the point. So communion theory, again, presence theory, whatever you want to call that, it's true. There to some degree it's true, but it's not something that can really comprehensively explain or illuminate what the sacrificial system was all about. It's part of a whole, and we could just leave it at that. Another approach is consecration theory. In some Old Testament passages, it seems the primary reason for bringing an offering was to consecrate someone or something to the Lord, to sanctify it, to give it sacred status, to make it holy. to take it out of sort of the common realm and put it into the sacred realm. Leviticus 10:10 says you must distinguish between the holy and the common. That idea. Again, sometimes in ritual texts, sacrificial procedures, that will be sort of evident. For instance, in Exodus 24, the blood is splashed on the altar and on the people. And specifically with the splashing of the blood on the people is to consecrate them, to dedicate them to a relationship with Yahweh. Again, we get that. Leviticus 8 happens to the priests where they put blood on the right ear, the thumb, and the big toe of Aaron and his sons, and so on and so forth. So yeah, sometimes sacrifice is about consecrating a person or an object. Very true, but it doesn't comprehensively explain everything. Now, those are the three major approaches, and I bring them up because you should know that the sacrificial system means all of these things or includes all of these ideas. And at any given point, any one of them could be in play. And it just helps to sort of know that, to kind of think about what's happening and again, to try to think about what they are thinking about when they're doing a particular act. And we'll hit on all these things as we proceed. So let's jump into Leviticus 1. Not going to read the whole chapter, even though it's short. But let's just take a few verses here. The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock." I'll just stop there. That's the first two verses. I ought to say something about the offering language that we get in our English translations. Now, in Hebrew, it would be more accurate to translate this to present an offering, bring an offering, present an offering. It's as opposed to a sacrifice. Let's put it that way. Sacrifices and offerings are not necessarily the same thing, even though in modern parlance, the way scholars talk about this, and frankly, the way I talk about it, the terms are often mixed. Technically, an offering was sort of a gift, and sacrificial language is going to be reserved in the Hebrew text to when an animal is slaughtered and then at least part of it is eaten in a communal meal. So sacrifices and offerings aren't necessarily the same thing, even though an offering might involve a sacrifice, but the biblical text, when it uses the language of sacrifice, has a meal in mind. And that's going to become evident as we proceed in some of these chapters. So you might, in your English translations, some of you might see offering there, some of you might see the word sacrifice, and you might know that there might be a difference here. Why is there a difference? You might ask the question, well, technically there is. Again, strictly speaking, from an Old Testament point of view, the Old Testament limits sacrifice language to animal offerings, animals that are part of the ritual, and even more specific than that, to instances where the animal's slaughtered and becomes part of a meal. But the offerings are much wider than animals. For instance, there's the grain offering, there are bloodless offerings and whatnot. So you might be wondering, well, what do the terms mean something? Can they be distinguished? Yeah, technically, yeah, but typically the way it gets talked about, people don't care, really that much about being terribly precise. We'll be precise when we need to be as we go through. So back to chapter 1, let's go to verse 3. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer a male without blemish. He shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. This, in a nutshell, tells you what the whole burnt offering is about. So if his offering, let's just go through the verse. The word there is korban. It's the noun form of karav, which is the verb form that is to present an offering. So again, this is some sort of gift idea. Turns out to be an animal. It's a burnt offering from the herd. He shall offer a male without blemish. He shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting. You say, well, why is that important? The offerer is allowed, or at least is hoping to be accepted, onto sacred space. So here I am. I'm Joe Israelite. I want to offer a burnt offering. We haven't talked about the specific purpose yet. And I'm bringing my male without blemish from the herd to the entrance of the tent of meeting. And so I'm standing on sacred territory. I mean, this isn't, I can't go any further. I'm right on the cusp here of where, the presence of God, delineates is his living space. And so I bring that, and my hope is what? Is my hope that I'll be forgiven of a sin? No. Do I want to apologize for something I've done? No. My hope is that I will be accepted quote, before the Lord. So what does the burnt offering mean? The offer is seeking fellowship with God. I want to have a little time with God, so I'm coming to his house. I'm bringing a gift, korban, a burnt offering, which is the Hebrew word olah. Again, korban is sort of a generic term for gift. Olah is the specific term for burnt offering. And I'm bringing it because I want God to not kill me. I want God to accept me as a visitor. I want to be safe in his presence, so I'm bringing this gift. Now you could say, well, that sounds a little bit like a bribe. Well, if that helps you, okay. I mean, I personally wouldn't use that language, but you're trying to, again, visit God just for a little while, and you have to approach him where he lives, and you don't want anything bad to happen. So you want him to accept you. It's a way of initiating a visit. It's a way of initiating a little time of fellowship and communion with God. It's like if you get invited over to somebody's house to eat. My wife is very good at always bringing a little gift. Okay, the icebreaker, the little thing to present to the host, that sort of thing. I mean, we do this in our the course of our lives in different ways. But we bring a token of friendship, little offering, a little gift, and so the offerer brings his gift before God, the whole burnt offering, because he would like a little bit of God's time. If we read through the rest of the passage, we find out that there's no specific sin that needs to be forgiven. That's not even in the picture. What is in the picture is I'm mortal and I'm imperfect. And I don't think so, but I might be impure in some way. I hope not. But I want to spend a little time with God because I'm grateful for what he's done. And to do that, I need to go to his house, and I hope nothing bad happens. I want him to accept me, so that we can have this little time while I watch my offering get burned up, and hopefully God enjoys that. That's the burnt offering. It's a type of the sacrifice itself. You'll often see it translated whole burnt offering. Everything was consumed on the altar except for the hide. So no one, including the priests, and of course the offerer, no one is going to eat any of this. So that's why it's called an offering as opposed to a sacrifice in Levitical language. Again, sacrifice technically in biblical language is when the offerer and the priest and, in theory, God have a meal together. There's something going on like that. The offerer might be included or not, but the priesthood typically is. But in this case, everything goes to God except for the hide. Everything's burned up. So that's why it's the whole burnt offering. It's a signal to God that his worshiper wants to spend a little time with him. Maybe he wants to offer a prayer. Maybe he wants the priest to pray for him. We don't really know. But there's some reason to be there that isn't, I did this horrible thing over here and I need forgiveness. That is not the purpose of the burnt offering. Now, frequently, the burnt offering was the first sacrifice in a ritual that included other sacrifices. And you can see the logic. This is the Kickstarter. This is the signal to God that somebody's at the door and wants to spend a little time with God. Now, other sacrifices might be needed because maybe the offerer does have something that needs to be taken care of. This is the one, again, that initiates the communing event. That's what it's for. So Leviticus 1:4, go back to the text. It says, he, the offerer, shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to, quote, make atonement for him. You said, well, Mike, I thought you just said that he didn't really have any sin that needed to be forgiven. Okay, right away, we're 4 verses into Leviticus, and we have to talk about atonement language. Again, you're used to me saying things that, again, you don't hear in church, so here's another one. Atonement language in your English translations, especially in Leviticus, but in lots of other places, doesn't mean what you think it means. Okay? It's not necessarily about forgiveness. It has a broad range of semantic possibilities, the Hebrew term that's underneath this one, where it's rendered atonement. So don't think that the offerer has a specific sin to be forgiven, because we're going to keep reading and find out that isn't the point. So he shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering. It shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. Then he will kill the bull before the Lord. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall bring the blood, throw the blood against the sides of the altar, that is, at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Well, wait a minute. Guess what? The blood isn't applied to the offerer. In the sacrificial system of Leviticus, the blood is never applied. to the offerer. Sometimes it gets applied to the priest, but again, this whole notion that we have of sacrifice because we filter it through Jesus, how the blood of Jesus is applied to us to take away our sins, that isn't what's going on in Leviticus. Okay, there's a disconnect there, and so we need to talk about some of the language here. Verse 6, then he shall flay the burnt offering, cut it into pieces, the sons of Aaron will put it in the fire, and arrange the wood, and it goes up in smoke. Around verse 9, it's a pleasant aroma to the Lord. And then from verse 10 on, I'm not going to really worry about that because if he doesn't have a bull, then if it's a sheep or goat or a bird or whatever, different kinds of things you could bring for the burnt offering. Okay, I want to stick here to the meaning of the burnt offering. So let's go back to verse 4. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering. Now that symbolic act, we think typically sort of transfers something to the animal, and that is not what they're thinking. This symbolic act served to designate the animal as a sacrificial victim for the specific ritual. In other words, this animal, before being brought to the tent of meeting, was common. It was one of a bunch of animals, but now it's being designated, it's being consecrated for sacred use. Okay, designating this specific animal is now belonging to the Lord. It doesn't mean I'm transferring now through some mystical way my sins onto this animal. Again, that isn't the point. We're going to see something closer to that in other places in Leviticus, but it's not the point right here. So the act should not be interpreted as, again, indicating some sort of transferal of guilt or transferal of impurity to the animal. There's no guilt in view here. The offerer is just bringing a gift to seek access. He's not asking for forgiveness. Now, the next line says, it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. And here's where we have to get into atonement language. Now, the context is the olah. Again, if you read through the whole chapter, and it's chapter 1 is about this one sacrifice, you will not read anywhere in the chapter that there's any need for expiation of sin. Okay, that's one thing. If we look at Exodus 30, verse 12, we get an interesting parallel to this. I'm going to read you that verse. It says, when you take the census of the people of Israel, then each shall give a ransom for his life to the Lord when you number them, that there be no plague among them when you number them. You say, well, how in the world is that a sacrifice, Mike? And let me read it one more time. The Lord says to Moses, when you take the census of the people of Israel, then each shall give a ransom for his life. The word there is kopher. It's the same word back in Leviticus 1:4 for atonement. Okay, there it's the verb, kippur. Kopher, kippur, it's the same consonants. So back to Exodus 30:12. When you take the census of the people, each shall give a ransom, a kopher, for his life to the Lord when you number them, that there be no plague among you when you number them. Well, again, in the context there, it's a census. It's not about cleaning up a lot of sin on a lot of people. So this idea of paying a ransom, okay, when they're counted, when they're enrolled back in Exodus, that's something that I want to focus on. The point of the parallel is that back in Exodus 30:12, there's no expiation for sin going on. Instead, it's protection from God's wrath. To be considered acceptable back in Exodus 30:12 really refers to we have a gift being given. In that case, back in Exodus 30, it was money. It was a half shekel instead of a blood offering. But the payment was given in that passage for an Israelite to be acceptable to occupy sacred space. And the reason is given 4 verses later in Exodus 30, quote, that they're giving it for the service of the tent of meeting, unquote. So there was need of precious metals. Okay, they're giving shekels here to make, parts of the tabernacle and accoutrements and that sort of thing. So it's a one-time situation. It's not an annual gift. But the idea is that, look, if you're going to participate in this, in building this tabernacle, if you're going to obey God and meet the need for the building implements for this, then for you to be acceptable to work here, to occupy sacred space, both now and in the future after this thing is built, you need to bring a half shekel. You need to contribute. If you don't, Exodus 30:12 says, there's going to be a plague among you. In other words, God's going to punish people who are not willingly participating in the construction and the use thereafter of the tabernacle. So the whole idea of the kopher here is protection from the wrath of God. And that is really more what's going on back in Leviticus 1. Again, Leviticus 1, the worshiper says, I want to spend some time with God, so I have to go to his house. and he goes to the door of the tent of meeting, brings the offering. Why? He wants to be accepted. Again, he doesn't want anything bad to happen. He wants to, again, initiate that relationship. And you do that, you signal to God that you're there and that you want some of his time. And if you bring the acceptable sacrifice, you'll get that time. You'll get your need, whatever it is, taken care of. Now, what does it teach people? The burnt offering, the whole burnt offering, didn't teach any Israelites about you committed a sin and here's what to do. What it taught Israelites was that proximity to God was dangerous. I mean, it was a fearful thing. Proximity to God was inherently dangerous for both the worshiper and the priests, frankly. Even if there had been, there was no particular offense committed to that point, if you do something the way you're not supposed to do it, and you knock on God's door, the quote unquote, there's going to be hell to pay. I mean, there's going to be a plague like back in Exodus 30. There's something bad is going to happen. So God does it this way, insists on this to teach a very simple lesson. You're not me. You're not fit to occupy the space that I live on unless I accept you, unless I embrace you. Otherwise, what you're doing is really dangerous. Again, it's a way to protect the worshiper from divine wrath. Now, again, back to the whole atonement thing. I want to say a little bit more about this. And if you don't remember it, fine. If you're not taking notes, fine, because we're going to hit this in other passages. But again, when we see atonement in our English translation, we think that there's a sin issue. Again, what I'm saying is in this particular instance, that is not the case. And in many particular instances, that is not the case. Part of the problem is that there are half a dozen different Hebrew words with the same consonants, KPR, as the one that occurs in this passage. This is what's known as a homonym problem. Hebrew is like English. Hebrew has words that are spelled exactly the same way, but that mean different things. So sometimes kofer means just a gift. Again, a ransom, something that I exchange to protect me, or work out, again, some sort of arrangement so that I'm safe and something gets done. That's one of 4 nouns that are spelled the same way in Hebrew, kofer. If you actually look this up in a lexicon, the one that occurs in Leviticus 1:4 is labeled kofer 4. It's the 4th one. So what I'm saying is, for those of you who attempt some original language research in your Bible study, you can't assume, and hopefully you have better tools than a Strong's Concordance. I mean, if that's all you've got, you need to move on. You need to move on to something better, because you need a resource, a lexicon that's going to list out the homonyms for you. Because you can't assume that the Hebrew word you're looking at in a primitive tool like Strong's always is the same word where those 3 consonants occur. In many cases, it's not, right? It just isn't. Hebrew's like English. Again, English has homonyms. So does Hebrew. And this word is one of them. So in some cases, it's just not going to mean what you think it means, and you can be easily misled in your translation. Now, in a basic sense, the verb kippur means to purge. Okay, we're going to hit other passages where the atonement language of your English translation is going to point to one of the verbs. Again, there are 6 different KPR words in Hebrew. 4 of them are nouns, 2 of them are verbs. Occasionally, we're going to hit a verb that does have something to do with taking care of an offense or a sin. And again, when we hit those, I'll return to this discussion. I'll tell you which one it is, and we'll talk about what the meaning of the passage is. But in many cases, when the verb is used, it means to purge. It comes from an Akkadian word, kupuru, which means to wipe clean. So that's significant because of things that we'll run into in Leviticus and other places in the Old Testament. For instance, the verb is used a lot with respect to the tabernacle and the altar. Again, to purge the tabernacle, to purge the altar. Okay, what I hope you're seeing is that when this atonement language that you are familiar with, if you've ever read through Leviticus, or God forbid, heard a sermon on Leviticus, and you've been told that this refers to cleansing the offerer of sin, be very careful. Look at what the direct object is. And in many cases in the English translations, it will completely obscure it for you. So try to use an interlinear. Reverse interlinear, like in Logos, is a great idea here. But in many cases, the blood of the offering will be used to purge the tabernacle, purge the sacred space, to purge the altar, to purge this or that vessel. It's never applied to the human offerer. It's to make sure that sacred space is not rendered impure by a common human being who is not sanctified as a priest to occupy. A lot of the sacrificial system is about preparing sacred space for your visit, or preparing sacred space so that God deems it fit to spend time there. It's really not about what goes on with the offerer's sin. Okay? A lot of bad sins that you could commit in the Old Testament, there were no offerings for. You got the death penalty. Or at least you were supposed to. There's no real direct evidence in Scripture that a lot of the death penalty offenses were ever carried out. But that was the solution. Removal. Okay? Other solutions to other sins was remuneration. You stole that guy's cow, you take it back, and you add one. It has nothing to do with a sacrifice. Again, the sacrificial system, somehow we have oriented it to us. And I guess probably because of the way we think about Jesus. But the sacrificial system for an Israelite wasn't about us, wasn't about the offerer so much as protecting the offerer from God, from the divine presence, because that's just, we can't handle that, or purging sacred space of any impurity so that God could meet the priest there or God could meet the offerer there. Again, we've inverted the system in a lot of ways in our thinking. And as we go through the sacrifices, again, you'll see differences that are going to be quite contrary to what you're used to hearing about this, but that are important. So even if you didn't sin, the whole burnt offering at Leviticus 1, even if you don't have a sin on you, as far as you know, you've had a good day, you've had a good week, whatever it is, even if you didn't sin, God has to be approached with caution because you are not him. If you are not doing procedurally what he has asked you to do, what he has commanded you to do, you're going to be in trouble. Okay? It is a fearful thing to be in the presence of God for an Old Testament Israelite. It is not trivialized. It is not something to take lightly. It's dangerous. So you initiate the relationship with a gift. Now, just think about this in terms of application, and we'll wrap up with this. In what I just described, would you want to live under that? I mean, I wouldn't. I mean, if I have to be so conscious of what I'm doing just to go meet with God, even through a priest, that I could get hurt, or it could launch a plague, or, I could wind up dead, or somebody else, it would cost them their life. I mean, that's just crazy. That's frightening. Now think about that, and you think about what the New Testament says about how God can now be approached. How are we supposed to approach God now? Boldly. Okay, Hebrews 4:16. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. In other words, I don't have to go up to the door and meekly knock and say, boy, I hope this gift is good enough or else I could die. Again, we don't have to think of things that way. And think about, again, what the New Testament says. If you're a Jew, think about what a New Testament Jew in the first century, who knows what the sacrificial system was about, even though they didn't have a temple for a while. Now they have, Herod's temple. And so they have some cognizance of what's going on here, about how people talked about Jesus when they're used to this fearful kind of system. And they can read examples in the Torah of people dying when they do things wrong. I mean, you look at another verse, Ephesians 3:12. Paul says, in whom we have boldness and access with confidence through our faith in him, to approach God. That is not how your typical Jew looked at this. And so Jesus comes along and a Jew hears the message of the cross, the message that, hey, this was your Messiah, died for you, forgive your sins, and so on and so forth. And now you can approach God individually and boldly. That was news. That was just dramatically different than the way they were thinking about their faith, their religion. Another thought is, we don't have to bring a gift for access to God. Think about that. Again, if you're a Jew, you're thinking, okay, I'm going to this weird new, gathering of these Christ followers. Like what happens, when I get there? Do I need to bring a gift? Do I need to bring an offering? What do I need to do, so that God doesn't strike me down? Hey, that is just gone. There was no need to bring a gift for access to God. That gift was already given for you. It was a voluntary offering of Jesus, of the Messiah himself. completely inverts and does away with this whole need to essentially bribe God for access, to make sure God won't do anything bad to me. And it's really unfortunate that a lot of people still think about God this way. A lot of Christians think about God this way. It's just utterly anachronistic to think about God this way. One last thought. If we're in Christ, we don't occupy sacred space, so to speak. We are sacred space. And that actually is the fundamental theological rationale for subduing the flesh and living in a godly way. You are sacred space. For instance, it's Paul's rationale for why you shouldn't, commit fornication, why you shouldn't eat meat, that was, again, taken directly from our rituals. Okay if it was in the marketplace, but you don't associate yourself with the ritual of the meat at Corinth. Why? Because then you enter into fellowship with devils, and you can't have fellowship with God and fellowship with beings who are less than God and hostile to God. You can't do it because you are sacred space. Know ye not, Paul says, that you are the temple of the living God. Okay, you have the Spirit, the very presence of God that was in the Old Testament, indwelling in you. Now, again, it would be easy for me to launch into a bit of a mini tirade here about how we do church. Again, how we do church is so focused on us that honestly, for somebody like me who, I try to shut it off, periodically, but there are places I've gone, churches I've gone into that it is so focused on the person, on the felt needs or whatever it is, that it's just kind of sickening because we've lost any sense. I'm not saying we need to go back and treat our churches like the tabernacle and we got to be careful where we walk and all that kind of stuff, okay? Because we are sacred space. What I'm saying is we have lost any sense of our gathering as being a sacred gathering. It's noisy. It's lots of running around. It's frankly some crazy stuff. I mean, I could tell you stories. It's hard to believe sometimes what happens in church. And we have lost just about all sensibility to anything like this. And again, I'm not suggesting that, hey, the solution to this is let's go build a tabernacle and act like we're in the Old Testament. That isn't the point. The point is it would be nice to remember that, the way I behave matters because I am sacred space. And when Christians gather together, yeah, Paul said individually we are the temple of the living God, but he also said in Corinthians that you, plural, you collectively are the temple of the living God. What we're doing here should in some way convey some seriousness, some thoughtfulness to the presence of God. How do we behave differently here than any other place? Because if we behave differently here, that helps us at least remember the presence of God. I mean, very simple things like this. I'm grateful when I see it. This is why, again, this is sort of freebie. In my experience, people who have left what we might call evangelicalism and have gone into like Eastern Orthodoxy or even back to Catholicism or something like that, is that they get drawn in by liturgy because what happens in the service means something. It requires thoughtfulness. There's symbology there that takes the mind of the person in the room, in the church, takes their mind and directs it to specific theological imagery or thoughts or ideas, as opposed to a sporting event. Okay? That's just what the appeal is. And trust me, I understand that. But I have had a number of people say that's what did it for them. And even though they might have a disagreement theologically here or there, I wanted a visit to church to be different from any other place and different in a specific way. So you take this back to Leviticus 1. Again, their problem was a little bit different. It was a little bit to the way extreme. But as we read through Old Testament ritual, don't wrinkle your nose up at it. Don't be repulsed by it. Yeah, I'm glad we don't have lots of blood in the altar and all that kind of stuff too, but don't be repulsed by it. Look at it the way they're looking at it and think about it the way they're thinking about it. And the lessons that it was designed to reinforce, even if you don't have a sin on you, God should still be approached with caution. This is not a normal place. This is not a normal event. It's something that should be considered sacred as opposed to common, as opposed to profane, which that's what profane means, common, ordinary. This shouldn't be ordinary. It shouldn't be like everything else is during the week. It should be different. Even if we accomplish that much in our worship, I think it would be a good thing. And again, I think Leviticus 1 here, the idea of bringing an offering just so you can even start to enjoy or experience the presence of God in some way without getting hurt is really a good lesson.
Mike, I'm curious, how much of pagan rituals stem from here? I mean, is there any connections to offerings to the lower G gods?
Yeah, there were, I mean, when you get into some of the specific terminology, and again, last week, if you remember, we talked about the need in pagan religion to interact with intermediaries. Okay, the main gods, the high gods, were sort of just out of the picture. You know, they could be sacrificed to and venerated, but as far as your day-to-day quote unquote spiritual needs, there was this whole intermediate world that you had to interact with. So there is a sense in all these systems of, you know, go back to the approaches to sacrifice, that we are offering gifts. In other words, there's some cajoling or sort of establishing a relationship that's important. We can't assume, we can't presume, we can't be presumptive about, you know, how we approach sacred space, whether it's an Israelite religion or some other religion, because the gods have picked this place to inhabit. They have decided to settle in this statue or on this ground to do what gods do. And so we can't presume, we can't be flippant about what we do in these areas, lest the gods be angry. So there is this, again, sense of otherness that is reflected in sacrificial systems elsewhere. The whole, again, bringing a gift, treating it as food, you know, that sort of thing. The communion idea is probably, again, a little less in pagan theory, because there it's more barter. It goes into the logic of idolatry. One of the reasons you built an idol and you performed a ritual to open the mouth, you know, to make it alive, what you were thinking is that the deity is now going to come down here and inhabit it and be localized, so that not only has it chosen to be in this place, but now you know it's here, and you can, you know, essentially do lots of nice things for it, so it does nice things for you. It's more of a barter mentality, as opposed to the Old Testament. Yeah, we have a tabernacle, we have a holy place, and God is at home, you know, that kind of thing. But God can come and go as he wants. God is not isolated to this place. God has specifically said, you're not going to make anything an idol, because I'm not going to be beckoned, right? I'm the one choosing to be here or not. You're not going to build this thing and beckon me here. And I just don't respond that way. And I can do for you, I can bless you or punish you no matter what is going on here. I'm giving you a means to know that I'm here and to approach me. But the terms of our relationship are laid out in this covenant that I have made with you and only with you. It's not based on, hey, did I like last week's meal better than this week's, or the amount of what you bring. What God wants, again, just like we read in Psalm 50, come to him with thanksgiving, come to him with gratitude, come to him, you know, with a pure heart, you know, the whole circumcision of the heart thing. It's much more internal than, again, sort of a barter mentality. But again, the logic of it, there's going to be overlaps there, and the terminology, you're going to see overlaps too.
Yeah, that's interesting that, they say a pleasing aroma to the Lord. That's a fascinating concept to think.
Right. Well, people would imagine, especially if it's a meal. I mean, you still get it here with the burnt offering, because even though it wasn't technically a sacrifice because there's no meal, the imagination or the imagery was that God is there because it's his house. God is there, and he's enjoying, you know, the scent of the meat, you know, being burned. You know, he likes it. It's also why incense was used. You know, incense was used so that the place didn't stink of carcasses and, you know, internal organs and poop and all this other stuff. I mean, this is a mess. You know, when you're dealing with animals and animal remains and whatnot, incense was used, again, to make it pleasant, again, for everyone concerned. And again, it was imagined that this is what God wanted too, because it was pleasing to us, you know, as opposed to this offensive odor over here. So there was that, and also because incense wasn't used in other places. So when you got near sacred space, it smelled different. It let you know. It was another sensory way of letting you know that I'm leaving the common and I'm approaching the uncommon, again, the sacred area.
is there anything to the actual location of the altar, as far as like, they had to kill it on the north side and they had to throw the blood against the sides of the altar? Is there any?
There is a little something to that. What I mean by that is there may be some significance to that in other passages. So my answer at this point would be, we'll wait till we get there. There is something to be said in a few occasions about orientation. Let's just put it that way. But it doesn't show up in a lot of places.
All right, then. Well, we'll be looking forward to that. Well, all right, Mike. Well, guess what? Unseen Realm officially launches this week.
That's true. September 1, the official date, right on the edges of that. Boy, I'll be glad. Just, but I should tell people, look, September 1, inside the building, we're thinking by September 1, all the versions are going to be available. That means for Unseen Realm, it's a hardcover. I don't know if it will be paperback at some point. Right now, it's hardcover only, but the Kindle version, that's actually already orderable, but that's going to be, up and running. The Logos versions, again, September 1 is this date by which all the e-versions and the physical versions that are going to be made have been made.
All right. Well, that's exciting. Look, it's finally here. So no stopping it now.
Yep.
Okay.
And go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, we should also, again, we don't do this every week or every episode, but thank our Patreon subscribers. We've gotten a few more of those, and again, what we're hoping for is that this will grow and allow us to do some different things. But we're grateful to everyone who has donated a little bit, on a monthly basis to help us out.
Absolutely. We appreciate it. And also, Mike, I wanted to mention, gotten some questions about David Burnett's paper. You could email him at dburnett51@yahoo.com if you're interested in getting David's paper. And Mike, could you give us a little explanation of what his paper pertains to?
Yeah, it's really focusing on the Genesis language, so shall thy seed be. And again, David's argument is that in Second Temple Jewish literature, again, the quote-unquote intertestamental period, there was lots of belief, lots of theological discussion about how that promise was not just quantitative. It wasn't just that the people of God will become numerous, but it was also qualitative. They will become as the stars, okay? So not just as numerous as the stars, but as the stars. In other words, they'll become divine. They will eventually be glorified. They will become divine beings. And we get this in New Testament theology, that we will become like the Lord. Behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God or the children of God, and we shall be like him, that sort of thing. Well, that language that we see a lot of different places, partaking of the divine nature, as Peter says about believers, that language actually was considered by many Jewish writers in the intertestamental period to be traceable back to the promise about the stars that God gave to Abraham. So that's essentially what David's paper is tracking on, that the development of that whole trajectory of thinking.
And again, if you want that paper, email David at dburnett, BURNETT 51@yahoo.com. All right, Mike. Well, next week we're going to be doing the next two chapters of Leviticus.
Right, Leviticus 2 and 3.
Okay, good deal. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.